So we continue in a series. It's the last one actually called The Heart of Liberty. And by now you might remember, there's a chance that you might remember what our mission statement is. And so we're going to put it on the screen. I invite you to read it with me. Our mission is to make wholehearted followers of Jesus. You can do that one more time. Make wholehearted followers of Jesus. And each week we're kind of unpacking what a wholehearted follower of Jesus looks like. We talked about our vision, which is the next one, which is what would it look like if we were a church where this happened? And we said our vision would be to create a community. You don't have to read this one. To create a community where grace is always found and all people are welcomed into Liberty's historic family of faith. Wouldn't it be nice to be a part of a church where grace was always found? Wouldn't that be great? Well, we've talked about our core values, and today we're on our fifth one. You'll see that it's authenticity, and authenticity is a very unique one. It can be trendy in a lot of places. Liberty has no desire to be trendy, if you haven't noticed. That's not our DNA. And authenticity, though, is a popular word, and it's a tricky one. Like the word Trinity, you won't find the word Trinity anywhere in the Bible, even though it's central to what we think the Scriptures teach. Authenticity is a word you won't find anywhere in the Scriptures, and yet we think that it's central to what the Scriptures teach. And so that's what we're going to unpack a little bit today. And in order to do that, we're going to start with a text, and the text this morning comes to us from Luke 5:27 through 32. It says this: Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. "Follow me," Jesus said to him, and Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. Then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his home, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to the disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus answered them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." So today we're going to talk a little bit about authenticity and how this text kind of leads into that. But before I do that, I want to just walk through the text briefly. You'll see in the first verse that it says this: Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. So picture this. Jesus is walking down the road one day, and he's got his little band of disciples behind him. Remember, if you were a rabbi, the way it worked was you were wandering. You didn't usually have a school like in Athens. You would wander around, and people would follow behind you. And so they had dirty feet, and they got their steps in every day. And what they would do is they would walk and they would wander, and one day Jesus sees a tax collector booth on the side. And that would be like one of those shops on 23. You just knew where it was, and you walked past it. And a tax collector booth would have been just like the Samaritan story, where if you were Jewish, you would actually see the booth on that side, and you would walk on the other side of the road. Why? Because this guy was a bad dude. What would happen is Rome would come in, and they would find all these areas, and they would conquer them completely. And what they would do is they would militarily take all their weapons, and they would take all their stuff, and then what they would do is they would say, "Hey, group that we've just conquered, I need a volunteer who's willing to stay and act on our behalf, collect money from these people, and then send it off to us. We'll give you some guards to protect you so that no one can touch you. But is there anyone who will volunteer, you who we've conquered, to betray your people and help us?" Who raises their hand first? A dude named Levi. Because he was like, you know what? I need the money. You know what? I don't really care what people think of me. So I'm just going to go and do it. You know what I mean? And to hell or high water, I'm just going to see what happens. And so there's Levi on the side of the road, hated by everyone, but with power. He had guns and he had people behind him, and everywhere he went, he took those guards with him because people hated him that much. There were several attacks against tax collectors back in the day because they represented the enemy. And Jesus sees this guy who is hated by everyone. Oh, and they're also hated not just because they represent the enemy, but they had a unique power. And their unique power wasn't just to collect taxes for Rome and send it off to the devil, but it was to collect taxes for themselves. And so they could ask someone, "Hey, don't just give me what we've requested. I need you to give me that plus 10% or plus 20% or plus whatever." And that would all go to Levi. And that doesn't make you super popular, right? I remember in our country, one of the things that was hotly debated, which is, do we give the IRS more money to be able to fund going after people evading taxes? Almost no one in this country wants to give tons of money for taxes, right? That's never been popular, and it never will be popular, and that's who this guy was. Not popular. And Jesus is walking, it says, along the side of the road, and he sees him. And instead of walking on the opposite side of the road like most people would, Jesus instead walks on his side, and immediately Levi's like, uh-oh, what's going on? That would already cause tension because no one walked near him. And Jesus walked up to him, and the first words out of his mouth from the scriptures are, "Come and follow me." You should know that in the scriptures, almost no one follows Jesus because they want to. They follow Jesus because he calls them. And so we call that in theological terms effectual calling. We're not here, and the people that follow Jesus aren't there because they looked at Jesus and decided they wanted to get rid of everything. Instead, what happens is Jesus is the one who takes the first step toward us. If it were up to me in my life, am I the one that comes running to God to ask for help and to ask for God's mercy? No, I'm usually the one that goes the other way. But the most important moments in my life have been the ones where even in my disobedience, I feel like God walks toward me and says, "Chris, come with me." And so that's what he does here. In the next verse it says, "Then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house. And a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them." And so the story starts to get deeper and darker as it goes on. We quickly learn that there's a great banquet and a lot of people at this house. So it immediately tells you something about Levi, right? He had a nice house. He had a nice house. So this guy had been taking a lot of money over the years. And then what I find astounding about this is here's Jesus. He goes to this tax collector and he says, "Hey, I want to eat dinner at your house. Come follow me." And the very next thing that he does is what most Christians don't do, is he goes out and invites other people to come with him. Usually we think that when Jesus calls us, it's like, oh yes, me and Jesus time. It's going to be me and Jesus forever. This is the best thing. This is all for me. I can't wait. But Levi does the healthy, right thing, which is Jesus calls him, and he experiences this kind of love that he's not used to feeling. And his very next action is what? I'm going to open my house. I'm going to show hospitality. I'm going to be extraordinarily generous. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my house and find all the other people that are broken and lost and hurting and hated and on the outskirts of society just like me. And I'm going to let them know that there's this guy who says we're loved. And so he throws this huge party. And you can imagine what that would have been like. Could you imagine if you were at this party? I mean, if you could go back in time, there's a lot of things you'd want to do. You could be there at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. You could be there at the cross. I think I would be really interested to know what this party was like. How cool would it have been to experiencing the grace and love of Jesus, even though you never could have expected that it was for you? And here is a group of people just sitting around a table in shock that they were loved. And you're never going to guess what happens next. The next verse tells us this. But the Pharisees, these are the enemies in the New Testament, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to the disciples. Is it normal for religious people to complain? Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? What were they really bothered by? Were they bothered that there was a party? No, everyone likes parties. What were they bothered by? They were complaining, and this was their complaint. Jesus, you claim to represent God. You claim to represent all that's right. And yet here you are hanging out with people that do what's wrong. Therefore, aren't you a hypocrite? Like you claim to be good, and yet these people are clearly stealing money from God and giving it to the enemy, and you're saying that it's okay just to hang out with them and throw a party like nothing's wrong. And their complaint wasn't just like, you have to understand that they weren't crazy. I mean, I don't know exactly what the equivalent would be in our society, but it would be like this. Imagine, who's the people that are hated the most right now? I'm thinking of like this Israel and Palestinian war, right? Imagine there are people that had done despicable, horrible things, that are holding hostages, and had done all these terrible things. And then you decide that you're going to show love to them anyways, and you invite them over for dinner. And then all your friends come over and they say, hey, why would you invite these people over? Don't you know what they've done? Don't you know who they are? And I don't want to get political, that's just a silly example, but my point is this. Picture the people that are hated the most and inviting them into your inner circle and saying that they're welcome there. That's what the Pharisees are upset about. We can't be nice to these people. They're enemies. They're horrible. We don't want them in our community. In fact, if you invite them in, it's gonna make us gross. It's gonna ruin our vibe. It's gonna take away from our righteousness if you bring them in. And so they came to him with a complaint, and it wasn't just like an ordinary complaint. What was threatened was the identity of who they were. So you have to know that the Pharisees weren't bad people as much as they were people trying to protect what was right. And Jesus comes back with a one-liner. This is the next verse. It's one of the best that he gives. Jesus answered, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." And of course, it forces you to ask, well, which camp am I in? Am I the righteous group who doesn't need Jesus? Or am I the sick group who needs Jesus? And of course, they were immediately put in the position of having to pick. They're like, well, I don't know Jesus. I'm not sick today. I don't need that much help. I do what's right. I do all the good things. And what Jesus is truly asking them in their heart of hearts is this. If you were honest with yourself, if you were honest with me, if you were honest with God, which camp are you in? Are you in the camp that needs help? Are you in the camp that's got it all together and doesn't need anyone? Today we're going to talk a little bit about authenticity, because what it does is capture the deepest reality of who we are, which is sinners who are in need of grace. The deepest reality of our life is that we are all sinners deeply in need of grace. And here's the claim I want to make today. If the church can figure out authenticity, we can solve all the problems of the world. That's a bold claim, but I'll tell you why that matters in just a minute. I'll give you a unique example that's for Liberty. Prior to my arrival many years ago, we used to do this thing where folks would come, and what they would do is they would celebrate like the heritage of this area. So like the way that you made food and like all the old pioneer settlement stuff, right? Because you go over on this side of campus and you're right next to the river, and there's all this old like cool stuff about when the very first people came. But there was a decision not too many years ago that was controversial, which is, do we and how do we talk with our kids about those times? And the school district here in this area decided, for reasons that weren't just ideological, there's some practical ones, but they decided not to do those kinds of events anymore. Last night I was with my daughter, who's in second grade. And I went over to her book. It was bedtime. We had just gotten back from a big trip, but I tried to be a responsible dad, even though I wanted to just give her an iPad, and we decided to read a book. And so I go over to our little library, and I see this book that I hadn't read before with her. And it was 13 American women that had changed the world or something, that were brave. And I was like, well, this is cool. You know what? She's in second grade now. Let's start talking about this stuff, all the hard stuff. And what happened was, as we start turning the page, and actually the very first one was Harriet Tubman. And I was so excited to tell my second grade daughter about an amazing woman named Harriet Tubman that had changed the world, that had led that Underground Railroad, right? And had helped slaves escape and find their way into freedom. And within like the second sentence, I realized I had made a huge mistake. Because my second grade daughter, as I'm trying to teach her about how awesome Harriet Tubman is, goes, "What's slavery?" "What's slavery, Dad?" I was like, it's bedtime. We don't need to do this right now. I'm tired. You're tired? No. I had to say, all right, Grace. So there was a time when people that had white skin thought that people who had black skin weren't important, and they made them like they were the bosses or masters of them, and they had no freedom. I'm doing the best that I can to talk to a second grader about something that's just absolutely disgusting. To her credit and to the world's credit, one of the things I was so thankful for is she was so confused. Because that's not the world that she lives in. And she doesn't understand. In fact, before we moved here, she went to a school that was 100% Spanish speaking. You know what I mean? So she knows what it's like to be with people with different skin colors. But this is what I didn't know how to do. I didn't know how to talk about the past in a way that made me feel comfortable, and where I knew how to talk about it in a way that was healthy. Authenticity is where we're able to talk about things as honestly as we possibly can and own them, and also find grace on the other side. That is the hardest thing that you could ever want to do. There are two extremes in the world, And it's not where the church is. The church is here, but here are the extremes. If authenticity is this place where you can truly be yourself and be loved unconditionally, the world finds itself in two other places. On one end of the spectrum is where if you admit who you are, you're immediately canceled and judged. The second we find out something about you, here's what the world does. Is we're going to blast it on the internet, we're going to tell everyone how bad you are, and we're going to never invite you back. So one approach to honesty is judgment, right? And have you ever seen that in the world? Have you ever experienced that before? I was a part of a church one time where we were building these things called small groups, where we would get everyone into these little groups with the hope and the vision that authenticity could happen, where people could be themselves, but also find love. That was our hope. One of the things that we found out had happened in one of our groups was one person said something about something they'd been through that was really, really tough. And then the rest of the group decided that because that was a really difficult issue, they didn't feel comfortable with that person in the group anymore, and they kicked him out. It happens, and it's normal, and that's in the church. Imagine what the world's like. The world takes that mentality and amplifies it times 1,000. And we joke about cancel culture, but what that really is looking at the honest reality of humanity and saying, you're gross, get out of here, we don't want you. And we know that that's not who Jesus was. Because when Jesus saw tax collectors, what did he do? He welcomed them home. The other end of the spectrum is just as weird and just as bad. That's where someone says, hey, I've been stealing money for a long time, or I've been doing all this horrible stuff, and I'm dealing with all these things. And then the response to it is, well, that's just who you are. There's no hope for you, no change for you. That's just the way that it is. The world's always been bad, and it's always going to be bad, and that's just the way things are. One is full of judgment, and the other one's full of disappointment, discouragement, hopelessness, and lostness. And what we find in this story is Jesus doing something powerful and unique that the world desperately hungers for. What the world wants, what I want more than anything, is to know that there isn't anything in my life, anything I've ever thought, anything I've ever done, everything I've ever wanted to do and haven't done, or whatever those things are, God knows it already and still loves me and calls me his child. You see how that's an impossible tension to hold together? That's why the church is a miracle. The church is a miracle when it's the church, because what it's doing is it's living out this like razor's edge way of living, which is to say, I am both going to let you be wholly who you are and simultaneously love you in a way such that you don't stay there. There's a phrase that pastors often use, which is that God loves us as we are, but never leaves us as we are. God loves us as we are, but loves us too much to leave us where we are. But we live in a world where we're often terrified to tell anyone what's really going on in fear of judgment. One of the unique things about being a pastor is people do tell me some things, but it takes time and it takes trust. Because you can't just tell strangers your stuff. If you do that, that's voyeurism, it's probably unhealthy, and you can save that for Twitter. But in the church, when you want to start to open up, it takes trust. And trust typically means time plus consistency. And my hope is that we can build a community here where grace is always found, but grace can only be found when people confess something that's not right and then meet people who love them nonetheless. So we say, what would it be like if we were a community of grace or a church of grace? What would that mean? Well, here's what it doesn't mean. That we all hide all the things that are wrong and then just love the fake version that's presented to us. Often that's what the world is. If I can just hide all my baggage and pretend like I'm good, then you can love this fake version of me, and then everything will be smooth. Do marriages work well in that way? Of course they don't. I do a lot of weddings, and one of the things that I always smile about is we do marital counseling, right? And I always encourage them. I go, we can talk about all the hard things, and there's a list that you want to talk about before you're married, like money and whether or not your in-laws are going to move in with you or not. Like, there's a list. And we walk through it. But I always say, you know what you're going to find is that you're going to need someone that can journey along this path with you after you're married, because what's going to happen is that half version of yourself that you've presented up to this point, the longer you're married, they're going to know more and deeper parts of you. And as that process happens, what's going to happen is you're going to start to wonder, well, who is this person? I'll never forget, we had been married about a week. We'd been married about a week. And we got married on a Saturday. We actually moved to Germany the next day because I was starting school there. And so it was a wild ride, right? And we were stressed, but it was great. Our first few nights were on the floor of our friend's apartment in Germany. And we finally got into our new place, and it was like, wow, all right, this is what married life is like. This is exciting. This is great. And like day 3 of being there, one of the things that started to happen was my wife had like a stuffed animal or something, you know. And as I woke up in the morning, I opened my eyes, and she's holding it, and it starts talking, like she's using it as a voice. And I was like, Jen, what are you doing? This is weird. And it turns out she's just really playful. And that was a part of herself that she hadn't like kind of shared with me up until that point. And I had a decision to make on like day 3 of our marriage. I'm like, am I in it or not? Over time, what's happened is I still struggle to know what to do with that, but I do know this. I love her just the way she is, and I wouldn't change a thing. The more you get to know someone, the more parts of that onion get unpeeled, and there's layers and layers underneath. And there was a day, if you were a Christian, when you went to church, you didn't get to go online and find the nearest 15 churches and then start shopping around and find the one that you liked. There was just usually one by you for almost all of Christian history. And so what that meant is the people that you went to church with were the only people you could go to church with. And what that meant in those days was when you would go to church, it was with the people that lived next to you, and with this person down the street, and that's the person that you did your banking with, and this is you know what I mean? It was like a community. And in fact, when this church started, I bet it was a lot like that. There weren't like 80 churches here like there are now. There was just one, and when you went there, you knew everyone. And what that meant was, in a community like that, you would have to deal with your problems. If you owed this person money and didn't pay it back, you couldn't just go to another church where you would never see them again. You had to wrestle with it. And in some churches, we call it the passing of the peace, where you would like turn to one another. Have you ever heard that phrase, passing of the peace? It's like an old school thing that some churches do. And what that literally was responsible for and important for in most of church history was that was the time where all the sinners in the congregation that were fighting with one another realized that in order to make things work, they had to forgive one another. That's the way the world was designed to work. But in our day and age, the way that it works is I'm just going to present the best version of myself that I can. And if anyone finds out anything really dark about me, I just need to go move to a new town or find a new church or make some new friends and start over with a new life, because there's no way I can actually deal with reality. And I don't blame them, because often when we tell people what's going on or there's a problem in our life, instead of meeting grace, we meet people that judge us. The reason why authenticity is important is because when Jesus found sinners and he found people that were sick, rather than kick them out or tell them that they were fine the way they were, he said, I know everything about you, and I love you nonetheless. Come follow me, and you'll find freedom in life. And if we can do that here, if any church can do it anywhere, it's funny, that's exactly what the world needs. We live in a world where we're all terrified and ashamed to be who we really are, because we know that if we are, we won't be safe. But I want you to know that there's a God who made the world, that knows the day you were born, knows how many hairs are on your head, or in some of your cases, not very many. I can count on one hand. But God knows everything about you, and still walked over to the other side of the road to find you. And he said, it's not okay for you to be alone. Come over to my house. Let's have dinner together. And then he showed you a better way. And he said, welcome home. If you want to be a wholehearted follower of Jesus, you have to be willing to be honest with Jesus. He already knows anyways. But one of the important steps that you'll take in your life is to say, Jesus, I've got all this stuff, but I need you in. So I'm going to end this series right now by, Steve, will you come on up for this part? What we're going to do is just end the service this morning with just 3 minutes of quietness. We're not going to do this all the time, but just once in a while. If God already knows everything that's true about you, is there anything today that's keeping you from being a wholehearted follower of Jesus? We talked about some of them. Some of in my life, it's generosity. I want to be more generous with my time, with my energy, but I don't feel like I can. For some of us, it's hospitality. I don't like inviting other people in. I'd rather keep them over here. For some of us, it's authenticity. I'm scared to be who I really am and tell people what's going on in my life. I'm scared to talk to God that way. I don't know what it is with you. But this is a church that wants to make wholehearted followers of Jesus. And so we're just going to give you a minute to reflect deeply on your life and where you're at spiritually and where God's talking to you, because we believe God is alive and God talks and His Holy Spirit's in this room. But if you had a couple minutes just to reflect on where God's calling you, this is that time for you.